Our user data provider is now responsible for loading the collection of users. But we lost pagination and filtering because the normal data provider from Doctrine usually handles that. Let's actually find that class. I'll hit Shift and look for Collection Data Provider. I'm kind of guessing that name. Oh, and make sure to include non-project items. Here it is, a collection data provider in the Doctrine ORM bridge. Look down at Get Collection. It creates a query builder and then loops over something called the collection extensions. This is the Doctrine extension system in API platform. And these extensions are actually what is responsible for changing the query to add things like pagination and filtering. Finally, at the bottom, we execute the query and get the result. Oh, and notice, this class uses the context-aware collection data provider interface. That is why, in our user data provider, I chose to implement that instead of just collection data provider interface. I knew that we were going to eventually want to call the core Doctrine provider. And when we do, we would want to pass it the context argument. So instead of doing the query ourselves, let's call the core Doctrine service. Our first job is to find out what its service ID is. At your terminal, run bin console debug container. Let's search for data_provider. Let's see. API Platform Doctrine ORM Collection Data Provider. Oh, but there is another one with almost the same name below it. And at the bottom, there's another one called API Platform Collection Data Provider. This last one is almost definitely the entire data provider system. It's the service that's responsible for calling the supports method on all the true data providers. So we don't want to inject and call this because we would just end up calling ourselves again. We saw this when we decorated the data persisters. But what about these two ORM collection data provider services up here? Which one should we use? I'll hit 0 to get more details about the first. It's subtle. Abstract, yes. An abstract service is not a real service. It's more of a template that you can use to build real services. If we tried to inject this, Symfony would give us an error to tell us. Let's run the command again. This time, check out the other one. Yes, abstract, no. This is the real service. The default is referring to our default ORM connection. Okay, let's go use this. Over in User Data Provider, remove the user repository argument. Instead, inject a collection data provider interface, and I'll call it Collection Data Provider. You can also type in the specific Doctrine Data Provider class that we know we're going to inject. Your call. Rename the argument and property, and then in Get Collection, return this arrow collection data provider arrow get collection, and pass it resource class, operation name, and it looks a bit silly, but also pass context. That argument doesn't exist on the get collection method of collection data provider interface, but we know that it will exist in the Doctrine class. If we stopped now and tried things, don't try things unless you have Xdebug installed, because it's recursion, every programmer's favorite thing. By default, Symfony will auto-wire the main collection data provider. It calls us, we call it calls us, chaos ensues. We had the same problem with our data persister. To fix this, open config/services.yaml and, at the bottom, override the user data provider service, app/dataprovider/user data provider. Add bind, and in this case, we are going to bind the collection data provider argument. Set this to @, then go copy the service ID that we need and paste it. Now it should work. Refresh the browser, and got it. Let's check the number of results. And yes, it stops at 30 users, but says that there are 51 total. Pagination is back. Now that we have a working user data provider, we are ready to add any custom fields we need. Let's do it next.